Good afternoon. Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Félix Streicher will defend the academic thesis entitled The Forgotten Occupation, Politics, Everyday Life and Gender in the Luxembourg Occupation Zone in Germany, 1945 to 1955. May I please invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Dear Pro-Rector, thank you for a kind introduction. Dear members of the Corona, dear supervisors, dear family, friends, and colleagues, thank you very much for being here today. Your presence on this special occasion truly means a great deal to me. Over the next 15 minutes, I would like to offer you a clear and concise overview of the main aims, the approach, and the key findings of my PhD thesis. In essence, the dissertation that I am defending today is a historical case study of a very timely topic, the phenomenon of military occupation. In light of current events, the study of foreign rule, both past and present, has returned to the forefront of academic and public debate. Military occupations, unfortunately, remain a pervasive and deeply disruptive feature of international relations. They carry profound political, economic and cultural consequences, and they fundamentally reshape the social fabric and the everyday lives of both those who live under military occupation and those who enforce it. Yet despite their significance, most scholarly research on military occupations remains rather under-conceptualized. The historical literature on past instances of foreign rule fills whole libraries. Yet historians tend to treat these instances of military occupation as unique and exceptional historical episodes, rather than analyzing them as part of a broader history, that of military occupation as a distinct political system and a distinct social experience. My PhD thesis places the broader question of how military occupation functions at the heart of its analysis. Its aim, then, is twofold. Well, it went back to the last slide. Just gonna have to, this is not how it should be. I'm sorry. Let's go. Okay. So first, it offers the first comprehensive archive-based history of the Luxembourg occupation zone in Germany after the Second World War. From 1945 to 1955, Little Luxembourg occupied two German districts, Bitburg and Saarburg. As you can see here on the map, Bitburg in the north, Saarburg in the south, as a minor Allied power under French high command. Politically, Luxembourg's leaders hoped that this would cement their country's position in the Western alliances, give them a voice in Allied discussions on the so-called German question, so what should happen to Germany after 1945, and support their claims for reparations and even territorial annexations in Germany after the Second World War. But perhaps most importantly, this occupation became the primary stage for daily encounters and social interactions between Luxembourgers and Germans after the Second World War. This particular attention to the lived experience of military occupation brings me to the second, wider aim of my PhD thesis, which extends beyond national or cross-national history. By drawing on political history, the history of everyday life, gender history, and impulses from the emerging multidisciplinary field of occupation studies, my dissertation uses the Luxembourg occupation as a case study to explore two wider questions. First, how do military occupations function in practice? And second, what are the political, social, and cultural consequences of the specific ways in which occupations function as a particular system of rule? By using the Luxembourg occupation as a magnifying glass, my thesis throws light onto the deep dynamics, the political mechanisms, the daily interactions, and the gendered power relations that define occupation as both a political form of rule and a lived experience. Across 6 chapters that you can see here, my thesis explores questions that are at once relevant to the Luxembourg case, but that resonate with other historical and contemporary cases of military occupation. Issues such as political strategies of rule, dynamic power relations on the ground, daily experiences of uncertainty and scarcity, the impact of occupation on gender relations and hierarchies, as well as the role played by occupations in border disputes and in symbolic processes of nation building after war, are all at the heart of my thesis. The sources that I've used over the last 4 years reflect both my PhD's empirical novelty and cross-national character. Not only do they include archival collections that remain classified until today, such as, for example, the archives of the Luxembourg Army, but the sources are also inherently international. So as you can see, they include archival documents from altogether 15 different archives from 6 countries, as well as a wide range of Luxembourg and German newspaper voices, and finally, 26 oral history interviews that I recorded with Luxembourg and German contemporaries over the last years. The result of this is a multi-perspectival history of the Luxembourg occupation, one that brings together voices from above as well as voices from below. From the policy-making offices in the European capitals to voices captured on the muddy streets of occupied Bitburg. On that note, I would now like to take you through the key findings of my PhD, which are structured around its 3 main themes, meaning politics, everyday life, and gender. Let me begin with the political dimension. Military occupation must be understood as a particular form of political rule. As my research shows, during occupation was far from a straightforward political enterprise. It was a complex and messy process, frequently disrupted by international developments and idiosyncratic behaviors of populations on the ground. One key political issue that emerges from my PhD then is the issue of legitimacy. And I don't mean that in the legal sense, but rather what Martin Conway and Peter Romain have called legitimacy in action. That is, popular conceptions of legitimate government under foreign rule and the everyday processes through which rulers attempt to make themselves appear acceptable to the ruled. Military occupiers are, by definition, alien rulers. Their authority in enemy territory does not stem from local consent, but from the assumption of effective control via violence, or at least the threat thereof. Since that violates the norm of national self-determination, occupiers frequently lack legitimacy in the eyes of the occupied populations. And yet, as my research shows repeatedly, occupiers cannot just rely on violence and on coercion. Over time, sustained use of violence tends to backfire, as it tends to provoke popular resistance and ultimately destabilizes the occupier's authority. This is why all occupiers must find ways to sell their rule, meaning to present it as legitimate, even as welcome to those that they rule. To do this, military occupiers employ various strategies of rule. For the case of the Luxembourg occupation, my thesis shows how initial repressive rule in 1945, marked by a hard stance against the German population marked by excessive violence, gradually shifted to what was framed as a model occupation. And you can see here in this key document from the Luxembourg government from 15th November 1945, the Luxembourg Prime Minister telling the troops that they have to behave as good occupiers on the ground to convince the Germans of their occupation. This shift from a harsh occupation to a more benign occupation, I argue, was driven less by a peacetime rapprochement or by Cold War logic, than by pragmatic or even instrumental aims. Luxembourg policymakers and military commanders sought actually to win over German hearts and minds ahead of a possible referendum to annex the Bitburg and Saarburg districts to Luxembourg. Viewed through the lens of legitimacy, the changing character of the Luxembourg occupation in Germany then was less about post-war reconciliation and more about political calculation, a deliberate effort to make a foreign occupation appear acceptable, if even welcome, to those living under it. Yet politics alone do not tell the full story. The realities of the Luxembourg occupation were also shaped by everyday interactions on the ground. And if these, you can see here many ego documents showing everyday encounters, everyday scenes from the Luxembourg occupations. And these everyday interactions, in turn, fed back into political decisions made at higher levels. The relationship between Luxembourg occupiers and occupied Germans might seem clearly hierarchical at first sight, but in practice it was neither as straightforward nor as one-sided as it may appear at first look. Daily encounters between soldiers and civilians generated a whole set of social dynamics that could easily reproduce or challenge the established imbalance of power. In this light, my thesis refutes the traditional binary divide of occupiers and occupied as two distinct groups, and I instead argue for a more dynamic understanding of daily life under occupation. The daily realities of the Luxembourg occupation, like that of all military occupations in general, need to be understood in view of ever-shifting and multi-layered categorizations. Encounters between Luxembourgers and Germans were, of course, shaped by national animosities, threats and instances of violence, conflicts over access to various urban spaces, but also by business exchanges, by professional relations, by shared hobbies, by comparable wartime experiences, mutual assumptions about class and gender, friendship, and even sexual relations, which now brings me to the third and the final theme of my PhD. So just like wars, military occupations are not exclusively a male affair. They bear a deep impact on gendered experiences, hierarchies, and relations. Gender as a category of historical analysis allows historians to actually focus their attention on one of the most essential facets of foreign rule, the relational inequality of power. But the attention to gender goes beyond the study of power and the relational. It also offers an important window onto questions of sexuality, intimacy, and individual agency under military occupation. As my thesis then shows, the private and intimate were actually highly political under military occupation. The question of who was having sex with whom inside the Luxembourg occupation zone was not a private matter. It appeared of public, even of national concern. Sexual relations between occupiers and occupied figured among the most politicized and contentious issues of the occupation period, and both Luxembourg and German authorities went to great lengths to control the sexual behaviors of first female civilians and then male soldiers, thereby cutting deeply into the private lives of individual women and men. And you can see here, for example, the marriage portrait of one of the few couples that actually got married despite it being forbidden until the end of the occupation. Finally, however, the focus on gender also takes my PhD beyond the geographical territory of the Luxembourg occupation zone per se. As my thesis shows, the occupation in Germany also formed a key element in the wider remasculinization of Luxembourg after the Second World War. Issues of gender and sexuality thus had a longer impact and legacy on Luxembourg post-war society, national identity, and gender hierarchies after 1945. With these findings in mind, I would like to bring my presentation to a close. So taken together, my PhD offers a comprehensive and nuanced understanding of military occupation as a multifaceted political and social phenomenon. It shows that military occupation is not simply a top-down exercise in power, but a dynamic process greatly shaped by complex and often contested relations on the ground. As such, my PhD emphasizes the importance of viewing occupations, both in the past and today, through multiple lenses, be they political, social, or gendered, to fully grasp their profound and lasting consequences. These insights clearly extend beyond the specific historical context of my Luxembourg German case. The core questions of my PhD, how occupations function in practice, and what impact they have on all strata of politics and society, remain relevant today more than ever. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was so interesting that I forgot that I have to chair this presentation. So thank you so much for this presentation. And the opposition will now be opened by Professor Dr. Benoit Majerus, Professor of European History at the University of Luxembourg.
Dear candidate, many thanks for your presentation. And before asking the first question, I want to tell you the pleasure I had to read this thesis. And that's not only linked to the fact that it's well written. You really, once you start it, you are not finishing it. So I have 3 points that I really liked. The first one is that you are focusing on practices, on interactions, on what you are calling during occupation. And that's particularly interesting because occupation studies are often imprisoned by the dichotomy between occupiers and occupying, and you are going beyond this categorization. The second point that I really liked is that you are permanently shifting between your very small, in a certain way, small case study and larger discussion. It's not a PhD for doing a PhD. You have to do a PhD to be able to continue in academia, but it's not about a PhD in a certain way. You want to, and you do it, you want to participate in a larger and unfortunately also very actual debate about occupation. And then the last point I really like is that you are debunking the myths of Luxembourg as the perfect European, as the natural mediator between France and Germany. Coming to my first question, so something that is essential in your PhD is this notion of military occupation as a distinct system. And I would a little bit like to question this assumption, and that doesn't mean that I didn't like your PhD, but when I was reading it, and it's already very present also in the introduction, you are saying how much this military occupation is specific and how much you also think that for understanding the history of the 20th century, we have to rethink military occupation. But in a certain sense, you could also say that the 20th century showed that military occupation as such does not make sense any longer, because especially during World War II, the frontiers between what is a military occupation, a civil occupation, so does it still make sense to say that something as a military occupation makes sense, or is a paradigm to read the 20th century? And, you know, just going back to the history of Luxembourg, between 40 and 44, was it a military occupation, a civil occupation? Yeah, so could you a little bit go in? Yeah, does it still make sense to talk about military occupation in the 20th century when, in a certain way, it's a total occupation and this frontier about military and not military doesn't make sense any longer?
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for that very challenging question. And it is a great question, and I think it's something that is not discussed yet enough in the literature on military occupations from the field of occupation studies. But it is true that, I mean, already the German occupations during the Second World War, they completely shatter the concept of military occupation as it was understood before, by violating everything that has been written in international law. And now the question is, of course, I think, what should we look at to define a military occupation? And so far it has often been international law in order to define an occupation and to then analyze it and to point out the characteristics what make an occupation. And maybe that concept is flawed, as we also see today that some of the military interventions, or it's today often a question of relabeling it, that they don't work like we expect military occupations to work, or they don't adhere to the law of military occupation. And I think in that sense, it's more fruitful to actually approach it via a sociological approach, maybe, to see what are situations that are defined by certain characteristics as like the deficit of legitimacy or the use of the ambivalent role of violence. And then maybe we get a bigger outlook on cases that have so far not been defined as military occupation, but that are quite interesting to compare with other cases, and that maybe we should understand them as occupations. So I think the biggest thing there is, of course, looking at the divide between occupation and colonialism, which is still being done very much today, and they talk to each other in very many aspects, but international law says it's something very different. But isn't it actually the same part of like the back of the same coin? Like, is it not actually something that we should look into more comparatively? But as long as that has not been figured out, I think we have to continue to work with the definitions of military occupation that we have. So in that sense, it still makes sense to look at military occupation as our normative lens of military occupation. But I hope somebody writes an occupation studies handbook. So maybe that would help scholars to go and look at this from different lenses and develop a more holistic, more complex understanding of military occupation that tries to link these different cases that are not that don't make sense in the sense of being military occupations because they're so different in their aspects. I hope that responds to your question, or partially.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Elisa Mailänder, Associate Professor of Contemporary History at the Centre d'Histoire de Sciences Po Paris.
Dear candidate, let me join my colleague that it was a pure pleasure reading your manuscript. It is thoroughly argued, it is well written, and it was even a greater pleasure than to reread certain chapters with this book. And I particularly appreciate your multi-scale analysis, so this top-down, bottom-up, that you break up this clear borders of occupied and occupiers. And I also very much appreciated your source work and the corpus that you have assembled. And also the choices you made, because of course you had multiple choices. I mean, I discovered some even great photographs, but you made a very good choice. You selected certain photographs, and actually I already really liked the annex or the appendix. But then when I reread this, or when I got this book, it really shows it's really a very thorough, and there is a lot of work and thought behind that. So we share our interest in everyday life, in lived experience, and in gender. And I would have loved to draw up on a more positive matter. But I must be honest, one of the many questions that puzzled me, and all good works raise a lot of questions, that was the concerned sexual violence. And in the chapter 4, you state yourself, and you're surprised yourself, that despite your thoroughly archival research, you only found one case with of sexual violence perpetrated by a Luxembourg man. And you find it strange, but you then in the next chapter you try to explain it, and I have to admit it doesn't match with with what the field, the critical military history or critical military studies show. Because I mean, I just mentioned, for instance, Cynthia Enlow's great masterpiece, Bananas, Beaches and Bases from '89, where she clearly shows that the American presence in Southeastern Asia, there is all things you mentioned, there is a lot of sexual barter, there is asymmetry in power, there is also a patriarchal asymmetry and military entitlement. I think entitlement maybe is a concept that could be even more stronger in your thesis, and then there is also this purchasing power, so which is clearly there. And now you also described then in the next in chapter 5 that the Luxembourg, the politicians, the press, even the society see German women as, I quote, amateur prostitutes, or I quote again, vile seducers of loose morals. And so. And you also say these women navigate around the barracks like they do in all the occupied, in all the 4 zones, maybe less in the Soviet zone. So unless the Luxembourg men of the 1940s and 50s are a species of an unknown kind, why should this sexual dimension of the Luxembourg occupation be any different in Bitburg and Saarburg and less violent than in the other occupation zones? So, of course, there is a religious, a Catholic, an ethnic and a cultural bound, and you are right, they're white men and they're like neighbors in a sense, and in a clear sense also in a literal sense, and maybe, and that is also something that you underscore, that the families and their sweethearts are just around across the border, so it's not like with the GIs that they're far away. Okay, but still, why in your opinion are the archival traces on this matter so sparse? You say that on page 242. And what does this lack of documentation and blind spot tell us about the traps and gaps of our historical sources? And what epistemological consequences we as historians need to draw of that?
Thank you very much, dear highly esteemed opponent. It's also a tough question, and yeah, it's one of the uglier sides of doing archival research on this topic. So, as I say in my thesis, yeah, it's striking, this absence of records. I remember being in Koblenz in the state archives and reading this huge file of sexual violence, just going through all the reports, and they are gruesome. They're really like, you don't want to read that. And there's so many cases, but American soldiers, Belgian soldiers, French soldiers. There was no single file about a Luxembourg soldier, and I was expecting it to arrive at some point. And it is weird that there's really no evidence on sexual violence, especially that the one case that I found is from 1948, which is also on the temporal scale very different from the other occupation zones, where the peak of sexual violence was around 1945, maybe early 1946. So I think it's a topic that is incredibly difficult to research, because this is a topic that was often not recorded in archival sources. Many women did not dare to speak up, of course, so it was not put on paper. Many police forces or priests or local authorities did not want these voices to be put on paper, so they just refused to take their testimony. We can, of course, say these reports have been destroyed. They have been willfully hidden by the authorities now that then gave them to the archives, so they are lacking in the archives. But that is, I have to say that now looking at how many reports I found in French archives on every little misbehavior of the Luxembourg occupation troops, it's like hundreds and hundreds of reports on the most ridiculous things, and the French were really tough on the Luxembourgers within the first year. And even there's no mention even of sexual violence. But there could, of course, our understanding of sexual violence now is also a different one than at that time. So there, of course, were probably also other instances of sexual violence that would have not been reported because they were not seen as being able to be penalized. But I think that one aspect that is actually crucial to the one story as well is that this occupation of the Luxembourgers in Germany can only be understood mentally when you see the occupation that came before. And Luxembourg, the Nazi occupation of Luxembourg is gruesome in every aspect, with 2% of the whole population dying in the course of that occupation, being severely traumatized. But one aspect that is particular is that Luxembourg is occupied and then annexed by Nazi Germany. And actually the German policy, by German troops on the ground, they are being told to behave like at home, not as in enemy territory. So they actually behave correctly in Luxembourg. So there's no real precedent of sexual violence of German soldiers against Luxembourg women, whereas you have that massively in France. And French soldiers who have been previously in the Maquis, who know the story of French women being raped, who then come to the French occupation zone, they of course have this antecedent in mind. And so that they turn that again in a weapon, as sexual violence as a weapon of war. And I think that's an aspect that is absent from the Luxembourg case. That could be one of the reasons to explain it. But yeah, these are hypotheses that I have, and I have no definite explanation for it. But it is striking if you compare it to the other cases. And yeah, so I can only say this is there's an archival gap there. I'm not saying that it didn't happen, but just we have no traces.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Emeritus Dr. Joep Leerse, who is Extraordinary Professor Limburg and Europa at our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Maastricht University.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Dear candidate, I too read your thesis with great pleasure and with great profit. I really learned a lot from it. You've done great work. One thing I particularly liked was how the high policies of what was a hybrid annexation, something that was partly punitive damages, and partly an attempt to be civil and to win hearts and minds, how that ambivalence was totally undercut by the wayward cultural things like rumors about deportation or the stereotype of German women posing a threat to Luxembourg domesticity and the injunction not to fraternize even though we want to be civil. So all that interaction between the geopolitics and the cultural field is extremely interesting, and I thank you for that. I'll be coming back to that in my question. I will go to the high politics and to the international relations in my question. And I was struck by the fact that these annexations, while they present themselves as strictly a bilateral give and take between two neighboring countries, are really an entangled multilateral, multi-party affair. You present the demands as they were tendered after 1946 as basically a joint Benelux thing. At least they were treated as such by the Allies. There were, of course, demands in the Eastern Netherlands and in the Eastern cantons of Belgium. And that raises one first question, and it's just a question of background information, which you can briefly give me. Whether there was any consultation between those countries which were on the cusp of forming a Benelux cooperation society, whether the governments actually had any, talks or preparations to tender their annexation claims jointly, or were these just these three different committees that all had dreams of grandeur or irredentism or whatever it was? And secondly, the fact that the Luxembourg claims were framed in a Benelux context is presented by you as an occasion, and you say so on page 52, that Luxembourg was a welcome opportunity to let go of the French coattails. Now that I thought was interesting. Because when we look at what you write on the actual occupation, pages 80, 81, 82, this took very much place on the French coattails. They were, they didn't manage quite to let go. And that will lead me to my main question. The avowed policy of the Luxembourg authorities was to do a civil, non-punitive annexation that would win hearts and minds. And in the event, we've seen how that was exposed for the fallacy that it was. But this would really call for a comparative treatment about a similar approach to the French occupation of the Saar, which was the context in which the military was deployed anyway. So when we look at sexual relations, when we look at, ressentiment, about the culture of defeat, as Schievelbusch calls it, the vindictiveness, which for the French, of course, had badly misfired after 1919 when they'd gone through Rhineland occupations before, were another Félix Streicher in Strasbourg or elsewhere to do a study of the French occupation of the Saar in the same period in the 1940s. Would it have been harsher? How would it have related? Were there attempts to unify or to distinguish themselves from each other? So I would like to know more about the French coattails. So those are my two questions, the two sides of the coins. What about the Benelux frame? Would Luxembourg perhaps have been better off to present their claims together with France rather than with Belgium and Holland? And secondly, how did the Luxembourg occupation compare to the French one of the Saar?
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for these two fascinating questions. So the first one is very easy to answer. No, there's no talks between these different, no talks on governmental level between the three Benelux governments on the annexation plans. And also no talks between these different irredentist groups like the Luxembourg National Union. And the answer to why there's no talks is actually because if you look at the map in the first chapter of what the Luxembourg National Union wanted, they wanted basically to have the whole of North Rhine-Westphalia, which actually was the same part that the Belgians wanted. So they just didn't speak to each other, I think, as a way of not getting into conflict. They knew that they existed, but I would have hoped to find some maybe private papers of the Luxembourg leading politicians like Lucien Koenig. He had some correspondence with Nothomb, the French senator who was in. I have not been able to find some in the archives. And Luxembourg government, they are very well informed about what the Dutch and the Belgians are up to, but they don't talk to each other about it. So they just also try to see, what are the other ones doing? How far can we go? So Luxembourg is always quite the silent one in the three. So they always see what Belgium and the Netherlands do first. And then if they do it, then Luxembourg can do it as well. So there's no consultation on this matter. And as you see in the sources, that I think would have not helped them much, even if they would have consulted among the three of them, because the US government and the British government from the beginning on say this is ludicrous. No, there's not going to be an annexation. The second point is, the Saar case is a fascinating case, even though there have been many studies written on it, and it has striking analogies to what the Luxembourgers try to achieve. And there's actually a book by, I think he's called Bronson Long, who's written on a book that is called No Easy Occupation, in which he tries to do a history about winning over the inhabitants of the Saar for France. Now, the unfortunate thing with his book is that it is a very much one of these, what I said in the introduction, a case study that's seen as exceptional and unique. It does not talk to any other case of occupation at the same time. He just looks at the Saar, and so he doesn't put that into the bigger picture. What I can say about the differences and the same approaches of the two is there's one striking thing that the two of them do without really concerting, of course, is trying to convince the German population by food. Just improve their food standards, give them a better idea of the future under, let's say, French rule or Luxembourg rule, and sell them a vision for the future. That works very well in the Saar. And that brings me to my second point on the Saar, which the French can do and the Luxembourgers can't. The French, actually, they bring in a whole apparatus of cultural policy, of economic policy. They can actually deploy a whole propaganda machine to convince the Germans of this, because they are the only rulers there. And the Luxembourgers, they are second-class rulers, as I say, or how they describe themselves. And they are kind of scared about how the French are going to react if they put up a poster in Bitburg and saying, join us, let's become part of Luxembourg. And they never do that. They also don't have the means. The Luxembourg army is completely understaffed. The Luxembourg Ministry of Foreign Affairs, just to say that, it has 11 co-workers at that point of time. So they have a lot to do, and they don't develop the strategies of rule as the French do. And of course, the French, they can also rely already on their negative experience of the First World War, which Luxembourgers can't. And so the French are incredibly more sophisticated, which does not make them more successful in the end. But yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Aline Sierp, Associate Professor of European History and Memory Studies, also at our Faculty of Arts and Social Science.
Yeah, dear candidate, I would like to join my colleagues in saying how much I enjoyed reading this thesis. So congratulations for writing such an impressive piece. It's a source base, of course, which is really quite remarkable. But then what I thought was particularly striking was the connection to contemporary issues that you're drawing. And that's also where my question is going to go. And you actually started your presentation and you also finished with it, stressing how timely this topic is and how much we can draw these comparisons potentially. Would like you to elaborate a little bit on the contemporary relevance of your historical case.
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for that very good question. I was expecting it to come. Of course, I mean, I opened my presentation with it. I think we need a more informed, more how should I say, the field of occupation studies is something that needs to be developed in the future, and I hope that my thesis can bring some points to the table of that, because there are aspects of this thesis that actually are recurrent features of military occupation even today, and this starts off with this issue of legitimacy. And if I can just cite one case, which is the war and also occupation going on in Ukraine at the moment, where Russia has actually staged 2 referendums that in order to try, it's a 2-pronged approach, to try to show the outside world that they are legitimate, that the people who they rule want to be ruled by them, and also to, just on the ground, tell the people, well, you have chosen us. We are actually legitimate rulers. And this question of legitimacy is crucial to any military occupation, as it be in 1945 and today. This is just one of the aspects. I mean, the experience of military occupation is always marked by scarcity, by uncertainty. It's marked by heightened sexual violence against women. It's marked by a reshuffling of the social groups in society as men leave for the front, as women take on new functions in society. So it's completely altering the social fabric of societies. And then also the role of violence, which then, of course, is very much a different one in the case of Ukraine now than it is for the case of the Allied occupation. But the main goal is to show what is different and what is similar in order to conceptualize a more integrative understanding of military occupation. Because I think if we just do all these historical case studies and we see them all as unique and exceptional, then what is ultimately the point in doing a book on every military occupation there was, and there were many? And if we try to actually understand this as a broader phenomenon and to link these different cases, just like do a global history of military occupation in the 20th century, a global history of foreign rule, that can inform our contemporary understanding of what occupation means to the people who live under it, and how there are some patterns that repeat itself, but also what is new maybe in military occupation can sharpen our eye for that as well.
Thank you so much. Dear candidate, we have time for a second round, and I would also like to take the opportunity to excuse Professor Randerath, who cannot be here today because of illness. We wish him all the best. We thus work with the committee present here today, and the second round will again be started by Professor Mayos.
Many thanks. At the beginning of, or in the first pages, you are writing there's a very strong animosity among Luxembourgish political elite, and perhaps even among soldiers, towards Germany. And that allows you also a little bit to debunk this myth. But that's very much a post-war image, because even if you have worked on it, I know that you have read it, that was not the case for the political elite and for part of the Luxembourg society during World War II. So, yeah. So there seems to be a tension between a very strong point against Germany after 45 and part of collaboration during World War II. Could you elaborate a little bit on this tension? Are these tensions visible? For example, if you have Luxembourgish enrôlés de force who fought in the Wehrmacht, and not all of them were enrôlés de force, and you have resistance fighter. Is this tension visible? Do you have people that were later on accused of collaboration that have been in the military occupation apparatus on the Luxembourgish side? Yeah. Do you have images to debunk also this myth of this great animosity among Germany that is not something that is natural for Luxembourgish political elite?
Dear highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much. Very good question. So the Luxembourg Armed Forces, they are made up of, it's a very explosive mix of people with very different backgrounds. And as you said, there are resistance fighters in it. There are forced conscripts of the Wehrmacht. And I think you already mentioned one very essential point. Some of these forced conscripts, they came home and they told everybody they had been forced, but actually they had joined up a year before, so they had been volunteers. And so I think that this animosity towards Germans that these people displayed and they could act upon in the occupation zone was also a way of getting rid of their own past and trying to position themselves as good Luxembourgers. And this is a phenomenon that we find in every Western European society at a point. Of course, the Luxembourg army is aware that in its ranks there are people with many backgrounds, and they check them very thoroughly. At the beginning of enlistment, the Luxembourg army, every recruit goes through security screening, and the Luxembourg army is actually, if you look at it, very successful in doing so. To what I have seen to this point is actually you have a lot of collaborators who end up in the gendarmerie, little collaborators who end up in the army. And that is also not just because of the army and the gendarmerie and how they employ people, it's just also a question of age. Many people continue their career after the war in the gendarmerie and they just don't join up the army anymore. But the army actually tries, because it's staff officers, because many of the leading members of it are actually resistance members, actually is, I think, more adamant on getting rid of collaborators within its ranks. Now, something that is striking, that within the first year, you have a lot of letters that reach Luxembourg Army Command or soldiers coming up to their officers and telling them, soldier so-and-so in my company, I know him, he has been, what in Luxembourg you call a Gierlemenschen, during the war. He has been collaborating during the war. And so either these people then get expelled from the army, or I have found several cases where recruits take matters into their own hands and they just haze these people until they break down and they have to leave the military because of medical conditions then. But it is still, some people find their way into the army and they have a very dark background and they never tell anybody about it. And I think they also overcompensate by then going to Germany and being extremely aggressive towards Germans and displaying this hatred for Germany in order to cover up their own background.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Elisa Mailänder.
Thank you. Now I can ask my question about masculinities, and I'd like to go a little bit or draw some lines to the present. So this Luxembourg masculinities, you really beautifully demonstrated their second. You mentioned it, second class. Occupiers, their uniforms don't fit. They don't have the same financial power than French or others. But they develop soft power. So what I retained is they're smart. They are good traders, at least that's what I got. Inoffensive, so this inoffensiveness can be an asset and also a handicap. They're multilingual. I think that is also something important. So what if now we place ourselves a little bit more in a sociological but also historical longue durée perspective? So what importance or what traces did this occupation or this military these occupying masculinities leave today for your generation or other generations? Because you mentioned, for instance, this fictional character, Christo Knapp, who is a novel from 95. So in 95, someone reactivated this occupation. Or I immediately think about Jean-Claude Juncker, who was born in 56, I checked him. So he didn't, of course, live the occupation, but in somehow maybe in his education, in his socialization, it played a role. He had role models, male role models. So soft power and Luxembourg masculinities, and what impact does the occupation have today, even if it's forgotten?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for that question on, is there a Luxembourg particular masculinity that goes until today? So I think I would actually say that the crucial part about it is not even the occupation, it's just the measure of military service, which was introduced in 1944 and then in Luxembourg already ended in 1967. And that means that all men, of course, went through military service, and they went through all these rituals of typical military martial masculinity. And of course, that shaped their character. So something I did in these interviews, I actually did 32 interviews, of which there must be 15 conscripts who were stationed in Germany over these 10 years. And I always asked them, did military service change you or change your character? And they all said yes. And I think that they then described what they were, what it had changed. And I think some of them are, interestingly, very military-like qualities, but then, and I cite this article by French scholar Marly, who also writes about that actually these qualities are quite female connotated qualities, like making your bed, being cleanly, being able to cook. And they're very proud of that. And so they display that as, yes, I did military service and now I'm actually very good at home, and so that's a particular masculinity that emerges from that. But somebody should do a study about Luxembourg masculinity and how it was transformed by military service in Luxembourg, because the country is so particular. Since you don't have military service between 1881 and 1944, then there's a whole generation of all people born from 1925 to 1945. I don't know. Well, I'm not so good at math. That's what I did history. So they, of course, that had an impact on them and how they perceive themselves and how they presented themselves. And I think the military drums this masculinity into them. Since now these people are mostly dead because it's been so long, I don't know if much of that still remains of this martial masculinity, but it's difficult because I would say there's no traces now anymore of that masculinity, but yeah.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Lerse.
Thank you very much. I was struck by the interesting party political division of annexationism or not. You pointed out that the middle political center had reservations. There are people living there. What are we going to do with all those people? a recoil from geopolitics, whereas annexationist claims are carried by an irredentist, romantic hard right, nationalists, and by the communists, who probably saw it as the collateral for economic damages and reparations. Now, two questions derive from that. Soviet Russia, as one of the allies, was one of the powers that, out of hand, rejected annexationist claims when these were treated. What did the communists do once their annexationist policies were disavowed by Moscow? And what happened to the communists anyway in this whole thing, in all these debates? The other one, if we look at annexation as a form of, a real estate form of economic damages, I came across something which you'd have to explain to me. Possibly you did explain it in the book and I momentarily nodded off. That's possible. Possibly you can do it now. The Oerdam. Damming the Our. It's mentioned twice as far as I encountered it. And apparently, if I can read it without context, there might have been plans to put a dam in the Our, a border river, and that would involve territorial changes, and annexations would help them to do this. But that was already a plan in 1945. So could you please tell me how the Our Dam fits into the annexationist policies? Because I didn't really get it from your book. And the other is, what did the communists do after Moscow disavowed the idea of annexationism?
Thank you very much for these questions, highly esteemed opponent. First question is that the communists, their line is quite messy in this whole process. They are pro-annexationists at the beginning. And then after 1947, from what I saw, they basically shut up about it. They just don't mention it anymore. Maybe it's because it was an embarrassment to them. And then, of course, they started more and more to follow the line of Moscow. And so often their papers would just report on international events and skip over then the Luxembourg claims. Of course, they always stood by the idea of reparations. They never let go of that. Germany would have to pay for Luxembourg war damages. But they never explained their main point. For example, when the Kammerwald finally is incorporated into, or provisionally bestowed to Luxembourg in 1949, they are one of the only parties who don't say much about it. Whereas all the others, they have something very big, very much to say about it. They don't like it, but the communists just don't say anything. Coming to the Our dams, this story actually goes back even before that. It was a plan already in the 1920s. They were not built because the French government got involved, and they told the Luxembourg government that they could not proceed with these plans because it would give Germany a strategical advantage in these border region. And at that point, France was still seeing Luxembourg as an operational space where they could actually counter a German invasion. So they told Luxembourg, you can't proceed with these plans. They get taken up. It's basically the plans from 1926 that the Luxembourg government takes up in 1944. And they want to have these Our dams. And the Our dams, they are built actually in the end, but on a European budget. As a European common project. They still stand today in Nefjanden, but on a smaller scale. And Luxembourg wanted to have these Our dams because they saw this as a huge project to provide electricity for the whole of Luxembourg after the Second World War. And they were saying, well, if we want to build the dams, then we want to have the German part of the other side of the river, because we want to be in control of the two sides of the river. And they actually also, now I don't have the card here, but there's cards where they were calculating how high the wall would need to be, because they actually didn't want to just dam the Our, but all the rivers coming from Germany. So the Kill and another one. So that would have created the biggest dam in whole of Europe. To me, I have to say that all these Luxembourg, the first economic plans, it kind of seems to me as if a whole group sat together and they were just writing down whatever they could claim. And it's like, well, we could build a dam. We could also have the railway on that other side, which basically is not linked to the Luxembourg railway system on the north and to the south. But they wanted to have some economic assets. And the Our dam, since the plans had already been there, since it provided energy, I think it was a fancy topic, and it actually was one of the only points where the Americans were standing up for Luxembourg within the border commissions in 1948, saying, okay, well, you can't have the annexations, but we should look at the URDEMs more closely. And then it never happens. And then it gets built in different contexts in the end.
Thanks very much. If you're going to do a trade edition of the book, I'd really put that in. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's almost 2 o'clock. The pedal will come in soon. We have the beginning of a question of Dr. Siop, and then we'll see how far we go.
I'll be very quick.
Please.
Okay, we both have to be very quick, I guess. I'll ask an easy question. And this is about the gap in the literature, which you identified very well, I think. And you justified the gap by saying your research was trying to debunk a bit of a myth, right? The self-image that Luxembourg has of being the peace-loving, contributed to European unification. And I was wondering to what extent that has influenced your research, that you were suddenly standing on the other side to a certain extent.
Well, I think I'm going to answer that question later.
At the reception. Thank you so much. This answering of the question will be done over drinks. We will now conclude this session by me saying, Félix Streicher, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and of your defense today. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in
Yep.
Félix Streicher, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and of your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Verbeek is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I now invite your supervisor to take the floor.
All right, please.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Félix Streicher, cum laude, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of our university.
So we can take a picture. Congratulations!
Dear Dr. Streicher, dear Felix, today is September the 11th, 9/11, but it's a happy day for you. It's your personal jour de gloire qui est arrivé. A laudatio typically begins with the usual phrase that it has been an honor and a privilege, an honor and a pleasure to have been your mentor. In this case, however, that would be an understatement and somewhat trite. It was more than just a pleasure, it was an absolute delight to serve as your supervisor. You were the kind of PhD student I would highly recommend to anyone, and I will also explain you why. Let me put it very directly. This is certainly one of the best doctoral theses in history I've ever read, at least during my career here in Maastricht. What have you produced indeed is a brilliant piece of historical work. I have no doubt that this dissertation, once turned into a real publication, will quickly find its way, not only to specialists in the field, but also to the wider readership. The source material that you have used is absolutely delightful. You've introduced the reader to the worlds of major political and military decisions, but also to that of everyday life, to cultural sensitivities, collective and personal memories, gender roles and gender representations. They do not get bogged down in dense theoretical speculation, but they bring history to life. The dissertation is truly multidisciplinary and innovative. It deals with very serious geopolitical issues, such as the German question after 1945, but it also looks at the many complex aspects of the politics of education, of the politics of occupation, not education, politics of occupation, issues of legitimacy, authority, violence, power, or the lack thereof. It analyzes the various psychological and cultural aspects of daily life under foreign occupation, feelings of honor and shame, guilt, revenge, and anger. Oops, I'm missing a page. That's a little bit, oh no, oops, let me see. It's also about nationalism and masculinity. By the way, I know what I'm talking about. Memories of my own time back in the 1980s as a Belgian soldier doing his military service in Germany came flooding back when I read your work. In the army, I was supposed to learn what it means to be a man. In the meantime, I think I've forgotten most of it. It's about the many small aspects of everyday life, encounters between soldiers and civilians on the streets, in the pub, at someone's home, or in the church. And finally, it also deals with the intimate aspects of military occupation, affairs, romantic and sexual relationships with or without mutual consent, and finally mixed marriages between occupiers and occupied. What really sets your dissertation apart is, among the many other things, an impressive amount of exceptionally rich historical sources. The combination of archival material from local, national and foreign archives, as well as private documents, personal recollections and photographs, it's simply exemplary, and it serves as a source of inspiration for other historians. And you've brought them together brilliantly and linked them to the wider national and international contexts. The protagonists in your book particularly jump out of your text like living characters. Furthermore, your thesis is written in a brilliant, engaging style. It's absolutely ready for immediate publication, and I hope, and I'm quite confident, that it will be read by many. What also makes your work so special is the occasional hint of irony in your work. Your thesis could be dedicated to the famous cartoon character Calimero, the black chicken chick in search of his place in the grand scheme of things. In the Netherlands and in Belgium, this character is often quoted as saying, and I quote literally now, "They are big and I is small, and that's not fair, oh no." And indeed, when thinking of the post-war occupation of Germany, almost everyone will be surprised to learn that not only the Soviets, the Americans, the British and the French, but also a Calimero kind of nation such as Luxembourg took on the role in a concert of great powers. The international reader will be surprised, but also somewhat amused to learn about the tribulations surrounding the Kammerwald, or the Grand Duchy's vain attempts to establish a new Luxembourg across its borders. Reading these chapters is quite entertaining. Not only have you produced an excellent piece of work, but you also completed it almost entirely within the period of your contract. And also here, again, there was an historically charged anniversary. The manuscript of your thesis was officially approved by the Commission and accepted for public defense on the 8th of May of this year. In other words, exactly 80 years after the end of the Second World War. A dream moment for every contemporary historian. Your diligence, efficiency, reliability, and commitment are qualities others can inspire. You consistently submitted drafts and chapters with remarkable speed and consciously incorporated feedback of your supervising team. In that respect too, it was extremely enjoyable to work with you. And now I have to stop because I need to remain within my 6 minutes, and otherwise I'm becoming a little bit too lyrical. Before I conclude, I would also like to express my sincere thanks to your co-supervisor, Dr. Camilo Ehrlichman. Camilo is the expert on occupation history. Camilo was involved in the project from the very beginning. I took over as a result of the fact that my esteemed predecessor, Professor Mathieu Segers, who unfortunately passed away at a much too early age, and you learned definitely much more from him, from Camilo, than you did from me. I would like to thank also him very much for the very pleasant and very efficient collaboration. I trust that Camilo will take the opportunity maybe to address you more informally later today. The doctoral degree is the icing on the cake of your efforts. The faculty is extremely cautious when it comes to awarding the cum laude for very good reasons. For those not entirely familiar with our system, this means that it is a very, very good thesis, by the way. But the committee decided to award you this distinction without the slightest hesitation. Cum laude literally means a PhD that distinguishes itself. I also distinguish myself now from my Maastricht colleagues in terms of clothing, but it has, of course, other more pragmatic reasons because it has something to do with my affiliation with another university. Dear Felix, I would also like to explicitly include your family and your loved ones in my congratulations. They can really be very proud of you. I hope this is the start of a wonderful career, and I hope we will hear and read much more from you in the future. Once again, and also on behalf of my colleagues, my warmest congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Dear Professor Verbeek, thank you so much. This was a real laudatio in the real sense of the word. And I will now close this ceremony. And dear Dr. Streicher, you have to get used to this now. Sounds good, huh? Dear Dr. Streicher, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with your degree of doctor that you have acquired and also with this extraordinary distinction of cum laude. I've been chairing many PhD defenses now, and this is really very rare. So this is again to impress on the audience that this is a special distinction. And enjoy the milestone, enjoy the day, celebrate. And we will now take a picture with the young doctor and his family at the stairs. And I invite the guests to go to the location of the reception, which is not here. Maybe you can tell us where the reception is. Does anyone know? Because not everybody seems to.
Yeah, I think my two parents, they
can take you there.
They looking at it. Maybe you wanna ask her.
So this is still a bit of a mystery. There always has to be something, but we'll congratulate Felix also at the reception. But for now, we will take a picture at the stairs. Congratulations, and let's celebrate.
Thank you. Ich glaube.